Thanks again. I really appreciate this. So I got introduced to your work randomly from like your talk that you gave for Creative Morning.
Yes, that was
Yeah,
a couple years ago now.
it was, yeah, but I only found it maybe like I think it had to have been like last year, so only really recently. Um, but I think that your work is really impactful, and I love what you're doing with the Diversity Academy now.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk to you about your work and experiences that you may have had with microaggressions. And I really want to talk about the Diversity Academy that you started. So that's and all in 15 minutes. So
Great.
yeah, so it's really just going to be like casual conversation. I feel like 15 minutes is like really a good. I feel like anything longer than 15 minutes, especially on social, is kind of, you really need to like focus on what's being said and things like that. So, yeah, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Can you tell, I guess for those who aren't familiar with your work, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and, how your experiences have influenced your work?
Yeah. So my name is Bethaney Wilkinson. I am a lot of things. Primarily these days, I'm an entrepreneur and a consultant. I lead a small company called the Diversity Gap Academy, and I support organizations and teams and people within organizations and teams who want to see their communities become more diverse, inclusive, equitable, and justice-centered spaces. And so I am really, and this is probably tied to my own experience, I'm really interested in seeing people pursue organizational change from a place of authenticity and sustainability. I think it's really important that we are always asking questions about who we are and how we're experiencing the workplace context that we're in. And so I try to bring an emotional intelligence, mental health, self-awareness lens to my work because I think it's important and I think it can be often lacking in the organizational context. And so, yeah, I lead workshops and I write and I host a community on Patreon called the Diversity Gap Academy, where I get to help leaders and people who aren't necessarily in a formal position of leadership, but who want to leverage their influence to make their community a better place. I support them in their efforts to do that, mostly through content.
Wow, that's amazing. What was it like starting it? Like, I feel like oftentimes when we see people who have created really amazing things, we don't really know what it looked like on a small scale, like at the very beginning. So, what was that like at the beginning? Because first of all, I think the emotional labor of doing this is probably a lot larger than any of us can imagine. But then the actual coordination and the labor, the physical labor of creating this. So what was that like at the beginning?
Yeah, so it's come in phases. And I think this is the journey for most entrepreneurs, and especially as younger entrepreneurs. And I still consider myself a young entrepreneur. I've been running this business for 2 months now, so I'm a baby, but in that way. But the passion to start something began many years ago with things I was doing fresh out of college, whether it was just pulling together a workshop that I just created off, just I know some things. Let me go share these ideas in between my work, or having leaders of organizations call me to talk to me about their situations, their diversity challenges. So in those ways, I've been building the muscle for many, many years. I considered starting a nonprofit back in 2016 and just wasn't sure about it because there are a lot of nonprofits in this space. Is that the right vehicle? I ended up working for a nonprofit instead, and it was in partnership with them that I launched a research project called The Diversity Gap, which was a podcast and research. And so that was a big part of me getting to this particular expression of my work. But I say all that to say it's been following me for a long time. I've been doing it for a long time. Now, in terms of deciding, okay, I'm starting this in January, a big part of that was me feeling that emotional and physical labor of doing this work part-time and on the side, and just not having enough mental and emotional space to be a healthy person and show up effectively for my community and for the clients I wanted to serve. So I had to take some things off my plate. And then, as any entrepreneur knows, when you are doing something full time, it needs to make money. So you got to work really hard. And so it's a lot of me staying up late, sending emails and working on my website and trying to find friends who I can barter with to do different things. I'll coach you on public speaking if you'll update my logo. Like it's a lot of that. But it's also a tremendous amount of fun. I love this. This is my favorite stage of doing anything, getting it off the ground.
Wow, that's awesome. What's your vision for the Diversity Academy? Like long-term, big, scary goals?
Oh, that's such a fun question. I was writing these over the weekend. My big goal is to see the Academy become a go-to online training platform for leaders and teams who want to pursue diversity in an effective and liberating way. And so through a series of e-courses and training experiences, like teaching is the thing that I love. And so being able to have really accessible online learning opportunities for people to tap in and get the resources they need, that's my big picture dream. I really want to create some sort of certification program so that formal and informal DEI professionals can get certified in the diversity gap process. And then I also want to write more books on organizational culture. And so those are some of my big picture goals.
And what have you found to be maybe the most challenging part of creating this kind of shift that's in the work environment?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think I'm in a season, and probably because I'm in startup mode, where a lot of it just feels fun. So even though the difficult things are fun for me right now, but I would say it's difficult when I'm talking to clients who are working in organizations that aren't serious about the change. And then those people have to make tough choices. Like I was just on the phone with a woman who has been in this company for many years. They keep saying they're about diversity. They keep saying they're about inclusion, but they keep cutting the budget. And they keep wanting to filter things through HR, and they won't give the committee any support. And so that's difficult to face because I've been in that situation before as a person within an organization. And it's really hard to have to get honest with yourself and say, these people aren't changing. So what am I going to do about that? And oftentimes that means that you have to divest from the work within that organization. And that's a painful realization, because we so want to believe that if people just got it, they would change. But no, people aren't trying to change. And you can't, my dad always says you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, like you can't take people where they don't want to go. And I think that's a real difficulty for people who want to pursue diversity and inclusion within an organization that does not want to change. I think that's really tough to navigate emotionally.
Yeah. So the work that we're doing with Unpack It, I've told you about it, but we're basically creating a globalized database space where people can submit their stories and solution of microaggressions. And what I found to be really interesting is that oftentimes people, especially in the workplace, aren't quite sure how they could do it or could have done it differently. So I'm curious about like your personal experiences with microaggressions, either personal or professional.
Yeah, gosh, I haven't thought about this in a long time. I would say when I was probably younger, so I'm thinking like fresh out of college, a lot of my experiences would be related to, oh, you're so articulate, things like that. Yeah, I'm like rolling my eyes. I'm like, oh, that used to drive me so, I just hated that so much. But I would say as I worked longer and kind of was given more responsibility at work, it wasn't so much the things that people would say as it was, I don't know. I struggle with this because I've often been the diversity, like the racial justice expert on the team. And so it's hard for me to know what was microaggression versus what was like my role, because I was often playing both, if that makes sense. Like I was used to having hard conversations about race all the time. Oh, well, that little thing was problematic. And it wasn't always things about me. It was things like about the environment or the way we would frame, working in the nonprofit space, like having to navigate the savior complex, the white savior complex, the many leaders. Like that wasn't a microaggression to me, but that was a racist, aggressive force in the atmosphere to be addressed. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. That's interesting. I've never thought about an experience, like having to think through that experience from like your perspective as someone who does daily have these conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion. So how do you deal with that? I mean, because for me, I can tell when I'm dealing with microaggression, and it's because I don't have those conversations daily. So it's like, otherwise we wouldn't be having that conversation. Like this is obviously what it is. So how do you handle that in your mind?
Yeah, it's a lot. And I think, and that's another reason I'm working for myself now, because I couldn't handle it, I should say. Like I couldn't. And so I had to get myself into a situation where I had the mental and emotional fortitude to show up for other people, because having to both resist the system and experience the system was too much for me. So I handled it by making a transition of my work life. I also want to say I'm sitting with this microaggression piece, and I'd wonder, since you're like the microaggression expert in our conversation, I think what I did experience and have experienced is the expectation that as a Black woman, I am like impervious to pain and I'm able to like withstand anything. And in some ways, I think culturally, I have perpetuated that. But when that's reinforced by a dominantly white cultural system that somehow both sees me as inferior, but also as Superwoman, I think those two things would be compounded in little interactions, whether it was staff meetings or one-on-ones with the supervisor. Like there would just be ways of relating where I'm simultaneously like not good enough, but also I'm supposed to be the savior. And I haven't quite figured that out, but in some way that's like a microaggression that I felt daily.
It is, yeah. And I also am navigating that too. It's really interesting because, I mean, I don't really have this conversation. I haven't had this specific conversation about the inferiority versus and Superwoman kind of balance. One thing I think that has helped me, and I think it could only have been because of therapy, is recognizing the ways that I also have perpetuated that just for myself and like the way I present myself at work. And I think a lot of that has to do with just like dealing with just trauma of growing up in a very white society and not feeling like I had people advocating for me. And so I think a lot of times I personally, speaking for myself, because I didn't feel like I had someone advocating for me, I've taken that trauma in a way and then just been the Superwoman, like, oh, I can do it. I can help you. I can help you. And then it's just kind of perpetuated in that way. That makes sense.
Guys, it resonates. Now I'm like, I need to go think about that.
And that only happened, I only came to that conclusion literally in the last like few months of how do I center myself in advocating?
Yes. Oh, that's such a powerful question. That is a powerful question.
Yeah. And I think I've learned that it's really a trauma response to an extent, to always like my first reaction is to, how can I help that person? That person did not ask for my help, but I'm going to insert myself to see how I can be helpful. And then also I'm going to insert myself to be helpful so I don't seem like I'm not doing anything, so they don't think I'm inferior.
Oh my gosh, exactly. So then we are in this state of hyper over functioning all the time, and literally working twice as hard as everyone else, largely triggered by both things, the trauma response and by the actual expectation from the other people around you that you don't let anything fall apart, that you're dependable. Like it's a whole thing. I don't know if that's a microaggression. It sounds pretty macro to me.
So that's the other thing. It's the balance between what's microaggressive and what's just macro. You know, it's kind of a blurred line there. I personally feel like when people expect me to do things and I get the sense that it's because they think I'm Superwoman, that to me is incredibly microaggressive. Also, what I've noticed is where I work at, there are like a handful of Black women, and I've noticed, and no, it's gone unsaid, but I've noticed that this is before COVID. When we have when we have employee functions, it's always the Black women or that end up doing the cleaning up. And that's so, it goes unsaid. And I think part of that is probably because we take on that, like no one asked us to do that. But then it's become an expectation in like an unsaid, like someone else is going to take care of that, but no one looks at who's the one taking care of that. But yeah, the question is who advocates for us, and honestly, that's why I love what you're doing, because to me, I think it's very much aligned with that question of how do we advocate for ourselves, one, but then how do we compel organizations to also do the advocating as well in changing their whole systems. Mm-hmm. And those are difficult conversations.
Are. And how do we make peace with the fact that some people, that it's not actually, and maybe this is just Bethaney. I've concluded that I love partnering with people who are moving in the same direction as me, but it is not my job to convince anyone that my life is worth protecting, worth advocating for. I'm not here to explain to you what systemic racism is and to convince you that it's real. Now, if you already believe it's real and you just need extra help to understand it, let's talk. But I'm not here to explain these things to convince you of anything, because I don't need to do that work. And so I think for some of us, I think you're spot on in that we have to be doing that work in ourselves as Black women, as women of color or people of color, depending on the context, know when we're responding, when we're advocating from that place of trauma versus advocating from a place of freedom and of decision. Like I had a mentor tell me, Bethaney, you can decide what your proximity to whiteness is. You get to choose, but so long as you feel like you don't have an option, you're not free. And so even right now, I'm like, I'm the clients that I'm working with that are difficult, I'm choosing them for reasons, and I'm aware of it. It is not a habitual response. And that's taken me years to get to.
Wow. That's powerful.
I know that coach, I worked with her all last summer. She helped me survive. Yeah.
Well, I didn't want to take up too much of your time. I have 2 questions left. So one is, obviously 2020 was a crazy year, but what are you looking most forward to for 2021?
So many things that aren't even work related. I'm building a house. So my husband and I are building a home and starting a homestead. So that's been stressful, but so fun, because we've been living with my parents for a year and a half, and I love my parents, but it'd be nice to have my own space again, my own kitchen, my own laundry room. So I'm looking forward to that. And then my book comes out, the Diversity Gap book comes out October 12th. And so we'll start promoting that this summer. And I just think it's going to be so much fun to get this message out into the world.
It's exciting. Oh man, I can't wait until it comes out. And is there a way to pre-order it? Has it already?
Not yet. There will be in a few months. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Mm-hmm. Well, the last question is, where can people find you and follow you and your work?
Sure. Yeah. You can check us out on Instagram, on most social platforms at TDG Academy. So it's the Diversity Gap Academy. If you type it in, you'll find us. We also have a podcast. I'll be launching season 2 of the Diversity Gap Academy podcast in May. So I'm looking forward to that. And then of course our website, you can find us and stay in the loop there. And then if you want to follow my personal account, it's mostly pictures of plants and books. But if you're into that, at Bethaney Wilkinson on Instagram.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. Like I said, I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks. This has been so fun. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye.